Welcome to Time for Tots. Our story today is The Best Nest by P.D. Eastman. Mr. Bird was happy. He was so happy he had to sing, and this was Mr. Bird's song. I love my house, I love my nest. In all the world my nest is best. Then Mrs. Bird came out of the house. It's not the best nest, she said. I'm tired of this old place, said Mrs. Bird. Let's look for a new place right now. So they left the old place to look for a new one. This place looks nice, said Mr. Bird. Let's move in here. And there's a tree trunk with a hole in it. But somebody else had already moved in. So they looked at another house. This is a big old work boot. This one looks nice, said Mr. Bird, and there's nobody in it. What's coming into it, though? Look. A big foot. You're wrong, said Mrs. Bird. This house belongs to a foot. So they went on looking. I like this one, said Mr. Bird. It has a pretty red flag on the roof. I've always wanted a house with a flag, said Mrs. Bird. Maybe this place will be all right. So, can you see what this actually is? Let's see what happens. Yep. There comes a hand with some letters because it's a mailbox. But it was not all right. I guess I made a mistake, said Mr. Bird. You make too many mistakes, said Mrs. Bird. I'm going to pick the next house. And here it is, right here. And there's the church, and this is the steeple, and they're going to fly into that little hole into the church steeple. They flew in, they looked around. Isn't it too big? Asked Mr. Bird. I like this big place, said Mrs. Bird. This is the place to build our new nest. They went right to work. They needed many things to build their nest. First, they got some hay. They got some straws and some broom straws. They got some sweater string. Look, the poor guy, his sweater sleeves are getting shorter and shorter. And they got some string from somebody's socks. And some mattress stuffing. And they got some horse hair and some man's hair. Soon they had all the hay, all the straw, all the string, all the stuffing, all the horse hair, and all the man hair they could carry. They took it all back to build their nest, and look, there they are, and both of them have their beaks just full of stuff for their nest. Mr. and Mrs. Bird worked very hard. It took them the rest of the morning to finish their nest. This nest is really the best, said Mrs. Bird. I want to stay here forever. There's their big nest. Mr. Bird was very happy too. He flew to the top of his house, or in this case, the top of the steeple. He sang his song again. I love our house, I love our nest. In all the world, our nest is best. He was so busy singing, he didn't even see Mr. Parker coming. Every day at 12 o'clock, Mr. Parker came to the church. Mr. Parker came to pull a rope. The rope went up to the bird's new nest. And there's Mr. Parker with his hands on the rope, and he's going to pull it. What do you think's going to happen when he pulls that rope? Yes, look. It rings the church bell, and it goes bong, bong, bong. The rope rang the bell right under Mrs. Bird's nest. Mrs. Bird got out of there as fast as she could fly, and there's bong, 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 and there she goes scooting away from that loud sound. When Mr. Bird came in, all he could see was a mess of hay and string and stuffing and horsehair and man hair and straws. Where was Mrs. Bird? I will look for her until I find her, said Mr. Bird. He looked high, he looked low, he looked everywhere for Mrs. Bird. He looked down into a chimney, but Mrs. Bird wasn't there. He looked down into a water barrel, but Mrs. Bird wasn't there. Then he saw a big fat cat. There was a big fat smile on the fat cat's face. And look, there are some pretty brown feathers near the fat cat's mouth. Mr. Bird began to cry. "Oh dear," he cried. "This big fat cat has eaten Mrs. Bird." Mr. Bird flew off. "I'll never see Mrs. Bird again," he cried. It was getting dark. It began to rain. It rained harder and harder. Mr. Bird could not see where he was going. There he is flying in the dark. He can't see, and crash! He bumped into something. It was his old house, that old house that Mrs. Bird didn't like. "I'll go inside," said Mr. Bird. "I'll rest here until the rain stops." Mr. Bird went in, and there was Mrs. Bird sitting there singing. And guess what she's singing? "I love my house, I love my nest. In all the world, this nest is best." "You here?" gasped Mr. Bird. "I thought you didn't like this old nest." Mrs. Bird smiled. "I used to hate it," she said, "but a mother bird can change her mind. You see, there's no nest like an old nest for a brand new bird. And look, there's an egg in the nest." And when the egg popped open, the new bird thought so too. So I thought we might like to make a nest. So I've made two. I made one out of a brown lunch bag, and I made one out of a bottle-sized gift bag. For the brown one, I just cut the lunch bag up, and as well for the gift bag. Just above this fold here is where I cut them off. And then I folded the edges over so that kids, you might need your mom to help you with that. And then from what was left from the brown bag, I cut it into two strips, and I crinkled it up, and then I just took a pair of scissors and I cut it into strips to fill my nest. And for my gift bag, I had some sparkly tissue paper, and I cut that into strips and filled this one up so I've got soft area to put things on. And then for my bird, I took a pine cone and some fluffy feathers, and I just tucked the feathers in all over the pine cone so it looks like a bird. Then I glued two eyes on, so I have a bird for my nest. And I also got some eggs, and I put some eggs in my nest. Have fun with your bird in your nest.